Hi, I'm Brad Wetzler. Welcome to Fearless Writing. I'm an editor, a writer, and a book writing coach. And today I'm talking about what I call the dance of time in narrative writing, especially useful in memoir. And what I mean by the dance of time is there's two voices that really are necessary to understand and be able to pull off when you write a memoir. It's not so much just a collection of stories, but it's you want to create this dance between different periods of time. And I'm going to go into that today. And so I'll start by just telling a quick story. I get a lot of emails and phone calls from people who are working on memoir. They have a collection of stories. They've got some fond memories they want to get down on paper, or maybe they've even started it already. And they will send me a few pages, send me a couple of chapters, and I'll see that they're actually quite proficient writers. They do a good job of telling these stories, but something's missing, and this is where then I come in to help them, because there's a psychological shift that you need to make with memoir. And I'll often then ask them a question: well, what did all these stories add up to? And they'll kind of wonder, what do you mean by that? And then I'll say, well, these stories about Africa you remember from in your 20s and 30s, they're very exciting. You chase animals around, you help build this farm, in a remote part of Africa. And he said, well, I just want to tell these stories and give them to my kids, or, if possible, maybe if someone's interested, I'll want to publish them. Well, I'll continue to kind of ask questions then and try to figure out, well, what did it add up to? What meaning did it have for you? And what did it lead you to do or change about your life? And then they'll start to answer with, well, gosh, I guess it helped me to become, I learned a lot out there, and I end up, becoming a father later. And I'll ask, well, did it help you become a father? And they'll say, well, yeah, I guess so. And maybe it helped me in business too. It helped me, later in life in other capacities. And what I'm getting at is there's this need for a contemporary perspective in memoir and a need for a past perspective. And it's this dance between contemporary or now and the past that gives memoir its shape and makes it something that another human being wants to be interested in. So I'll introduce the voices of memoir now. And the voices are the voice of innocence, which is also called the then voice, and the voice of experience, which is also called the now voice. And I'll also offer a third way to think about them. Unprocessed is the then voice, and processed is the now voice. And so when you bring these two voices together and figure out how to use them effectively together, it creates this wonderful sense, and it gives your book meaning, and it gives your book something for the reader to hold on to besides just the stories themselves. Because some guy chasing animals in Africa can be quite an exciting story, but others of us who've just lived ordinary lives, where we live, even if we've overcome challenges, the content of the memoir can actually be about everyday life and not that exciting. But the way you bring the story and make it useful to somebody else, make it memorable to somebody else, is to add meaning to it. And this dance of time is how you do that. So let me unpack these voices for you a bit more. The voice of innocence, as I mentioned, it's you tell the story from the past, kind of in the mind of that person you were then. So if you were 5 years old, or if you were 15, or if it was 2 years ago, you have a certain innocence to that voice and sense of unprocessedness. And so you would tell that story, and it doesn't mean like if you were 5 that you would use the language of a 5-year-old, but you would kind of draw on the psychology of a 5-year-old and sort of that inability to make sense of our lives. And again, adding to that, whether you are 5 or 35, when we're living in the moment, we often don't have much perspective on what's happening in the moment. We're just in the throes of life, and there is a shift that happens. And if you notice this in your own life, it's one of the reasons that midlife is when people tend to start to write their memoirs or think about it, because in my experience, the past starts to recede a bit more then. Even things that happened 2 years ago seem to recede more for me now than they did even, when I was in my 30s. And it's that perspective, that receding of the past that allows us to draw meaning from it, and allows us then to use these two voices. So the voice of innocence is drawing on the psychology of the person you were then, seeing you struggle through the event that's coming up for you. It could be a memory that has been with you for a long time, a memory that you will never forget, and you want to tell that voice in that mind of the younger person. But you also realize as you start to write memoir that there's many seeds of experiences that you may not have a lot of explicit memory to, but you will have, a taste or a vision, or maybe it's even an auditory sound, but it will, like something happened. You remember like running a lemonade stand when you were 12 and something happened that day, and you remember the taste of the lemonade, but you don't overtly remember a whole lot more of that. But if you start to unpack that and tell the story of that lemonade stand, for example, you start to kind of unravel, and memory will start to reappear. And of course, memory is not, 100%, infallible. So there's some creativity involved in this too, but you can basically start to reconstruct memories. So your memoir eventually becomes a series of both, stories that have been living in your mind for a long time, but there's also many seeds of stories that are available to us that you can begin to unravel by drawing on this voice of innocence. Now, there's one thing I want to add to the voice of innocence, and it's one reason that I don't trust fiction writers teaching memoir. It's because there's an element to the voice of innocence that's needed too, which is it's a word called exposition. And what it means is sort of like the who, what, where, when, whys. And so the reason I don't love fiction writers teaching memoir is because they often forget to add the who, what, where, when, whys. So even though the voice of innocence is written in say the mind of the 12-year-old girl running a lemonade stand, you will need to add in the who, what, where, when, why details. You'll need to add in, I was 12 then. I was living in, in a suburban St. Louis. I was, and giving other little facts. I was a shy person then, and I, other things that sort of like give it context. And so that word exposition actually means context, and it's actually, another way to think about it is you are polluting that innocent story with some perspective. But it's a necessary polluting of that story with perspective, because it gives the reader a sense of the context, the who, what, where, when, why, and the reader needs that to keep going forward. So that's just another addition to the voice of innocence. You want to add this overlay of context and information, and so that's the voice of innocence. I'm going to go into the voice of experience now. So after you've told an anecdote or written a scene in the voice of innocence, and you've done it in the psychology of the younger person, you've added in the context, the who, what, where, when, and why, just sprinkling that in, then you come to the end of your story, and that lemonade stand, let's just say there was a crisis and a climax, some boy came and stole all the money and tipped over the lemonade and left you upset. And it, so it had something happen in the end of that story. Well, after you tell that story, then is when you add this voice of experience. And again, that's called the now voice, or I also propose calling it the processed voice. And suddenly you can make sense of that experience and what it added up to and the meaning of it. And how it feeds into, say, the longer memoir you're writing. Say you became a successful business person, and that experience ended up being a crucial, life-changing experience at a very young age. And so how do you employ this voice of experience? Well, you do it by asking a couple of questions of yourself. You ask, how do I feel today about how I felt then? And how do I think today about how I thought then? And when you ask those questions, and you can just, in the first draft, you can simply ask those questions and start to really ramble about it. The whole idea of, you want to create a messy, first draft, but by asking those questions and just rambling about it, you generate a lot of feelings and perspective on what happened and what it meant to you and why. And it gives it shape. It gives it purpose and meaning for talking about it. Otherwise, without this voice of experience, it's just it's a story from childhood that, you lost your $6 and you got your lemonade tipped over, but we don't know what it added up to. So that's one way. So you add that voice of experience at the end, and the proper term for that is retrospection. You'll also hear it called reflection. And it's so when you create this dance, that creates this kind of now then perspective, and one of the effects it has is it does sort of shatter suspense, which is another reason often that I think when novelists teach memoir that it can be less effective, because novelists are very interested in suspense, and a memoir, you do want suspense. You build suspense into your writing, but you're constantly kind of undermining it just a little bit, because when you add that voice of experience, you're hinting at where you are today and at the end of the book, right? Because you're at the typewriter writing it, and so the harmful side of the voice of experience is that it can dash suspense, but it actually makes the memoir so much more meaningful, and it adds, again, context and something for the reader to hook into besides just the story itself, which by itself doesn't really add up to a whole lot. So now we've added the voice of innocence and the voice of experience. And I'll propose what you can do now after the voice of experience is to actually maybe draw some explicit lessons learned. And that's implicit in the voice of experience. You kind of doing some reflecting and kind of organic writing about what those experiences added up to. But then if you like, and not all memoirists do this, but it actually leads you to maybe some conclusions about that experience and what it taught you about your life. And there's an opportunity there to add, 1, 2, or 3, lessons learned. And so you won't find this quite as much in a literary memoir, but in a memoir that's meant to be useful to people, you might want to get very explicit there and say, I learned then, I'm just making this up, but I always started to lock my money up, and I started to keep my lemonade in tin bottles, and I also learned something about human nature, that that there are people out there that might want to destroy my business or whatever the lesson learned is. But you can start to extrapolate some hard lessons from that. And then once you do that, you can end a chapter there, but if you're not done with your chapter, you can also then you write your way to the next story that you would then tell in the voice of innocence. And that writing your way to the next story is what's called a transition. And at some point I'm going to do a class on transitions, but you'd have to go from this lesson learned to then diving back into the stories of your life. And that's kind of a messy process too, but there's often, some people say that most writing happens in the transitions. There's not a lot of mastery, and there is. In telling old stories, anyone can tell an old story. Some people tell them better than others, but when you start to transition to the next story, you make that story then relevant in the process of how you moved your life forward. So don't forget that transition writing. Sometimes, I think we learned in high school that a good transition could be the word however or but. And I want to argue that that's not really what a transition is. It's actually kind of a complex piece of writing that works us through from one experience to the next. And so I'll teach a class on that next time. And then I want to introduce a third voice, which you might include in your writing. And I call it, I call it a journalistic voice. And so, we've got the voice of innocence, the then voice. We've got the voice of experience, the now voice. There's also, you can access a third voice, and it's this journalistic voice. And it's a cool thing to add to your writing. If you're writing a book about let's say having a traumatic brain injury, you'll be writing in the Voice of Innocence about old stories, maybe before the injury, or maybe in the early days of recovering from the injury. And then you'll add that voice of experience where you reflect on that. But maybe you also want to, do some educating about brain injuries in this. And so you might then do research and about, recovery from brain injuries, or maybe what happens in the brain when one is injured, or maybe, anything that would take research to add. But you would write that in journalistic voice. And it's, it's a moderate voice. It's one that it's not packed with experiences from your life. It's actually information. And so just know that that's accessible to you. And there's some great memoirs out there that add things like, a metaphor, for example. Let's say your story is about your travels and later in life, and everywhere you went, you saw whales. You'd go to Baja California and you would see whales. You'd go to Ireland and see whales. And whales end up becoming kind of a central organizing theme of your book. Well, you could certainly then add information about whales, and even, especially information that kind of would add more context to your life. I mean, whales are mammals in the ocean. They and I don't know a lot about whales, but they're survivors from animals that actually, walked. Actually, I'm going to stop talking about whales. I don't know much about them. I read something about them recently, but anyway, whales. So anyway, what I'm trying to get to here is that there's a way to kind of draw on how whales live, how whales function, and maybe there's some parallel you can draw to your own life. Whether it's whales or something else, it could be anything. It could be pottery. It could be, these central metaphors that can help a memoir take on, a bigger meaning and land with people in a way that, just talking about your life can sometimes feel smaller. So that's just, I wanted to add that third voice and this third idea that there's a way to add more meaning to your memoir by introducing journalistic writing, and especially if you can find like a metaphor or something in the physical world to teach from and to educate the reader about. So not only do they get the story of your life, not only do they get what it added up to and the lessons you've learned, but they also learn some things about some external subject that is just fun and useful and just, makes the book added value to them. So